The headlines have already moved on, and that alone should make you suspicious. Because when the media moves on quickly, it usually means the real consequences are only beginning. The airstrikes ended, the press conferences wrapped up. Officials delivered their talking points, and the public narrative closed the file as if Venezuela were a self-contained episode. But nothing about what just happened fits the profile of an isolated crisis. This was not a reaction. It was a move. And moves like this are never about the person being removed, arrested, or flown out of the country. They are about positioning. They are about leverage. And most importantly, they are about preparing for a future that policymakers believe is coming faster than most people realize. To understand what Venezuela actually represents, you have to stop thinking in terms of domestic politics and start thinking in terms of systems. Global power today is not enforced primarily through conquest or occupation. It is enforced through supply chains, pricing mechanisms, financial plumbing, and control over infrastructure. Armies matter. But what matters more is who decides how goods move, what currency is used to pay for them, and which routes remain open or closed in moments of stress. That is the level at which Venezuela suddenly becomes important again. This is why Venezuela cannot be analyzed on its own. It must be viewed alongside Greenland, the Panama Canal, renewed trade pressure on Canada, and intensified diplomatic focus on Latin America. These are not disconnected issues. They are pieces of a single strategic puzzle centered on one question. How does a declining hegemon secure its economic perimeter in a world where competitors are no longer playing by its rules? The official language frames these moves as national security, regional stability, or defense of democratic norms. That language is useful politically, but it obscures the real mechanism at work. Strip away the rhetoric, and what remains is economic containment. Control the resources, control the routes, control the systems that set prices and clear payments. Deny rivals the ability to operate independently within those systems. That is how power is exercised in the modern world, and Venezuela sits directly on one of the most sensitive fault lines in that architecture. South America has quietly transformed into an economic battleground over the past 2 decades, and most people in the United States barely noticed it happening. While attention was focused on the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and the Indo-Pacific, China was methodically expanding its economic footprint across Latin America. Not through military bases or ideological campaigns, but through trade agreements, infrastructure financing, and long-term commodity contracts. This approach does not generate dramatic headlines, but it produces durable influence. 20 years ago, China barely registered as a trading partner for most Latin American countries. Today, it is the dominant partner for many of them. Brazil, Peru, Chile, and several others now trade more with China than with the United States. This shift did not happen overnight, and it did not happen accidentally. It was the result of deliberate policy choices on both sides. Latin American governments sought diversified partners and financing without political conditionality. China sought secure access to food, energy, and raw materials, as well as new markets for its industrial output. Trade numbers alone do not capture the full scope of this transformation. What matters more is infrastructure. Ports, railways, logistics hubs, and energy facilities determine how trade actually flows. Chinese firms now own or operate major ports across the region, including facilities in Peru, Brazil, Ecuador, and Panama. These ports are not symbolic investments. They are designed to integrate South American supply chains directly with Asia, bypassing North American routes that once acted as choke points. The opening of the Janse port in Peru is a perfect illustration. This facility was built to handle exports from multiple South American countries and ship them directly across the Pacific. From a commercial perspective, it reduces transit time and cost. From a strategic perspective, it reduces dependence on U.S.-centric logistics networks. That distinction matters enormously in a world where economic coercion is increasingly used as a policy tool. From Washington's perspective, this trend represents more than lost market share. It represents a gradual erosion of influence in a region long treated as strategically secure. Influence does not disappear all at once. It fades as alternative systems become viable. When countries can trade, finance, insure, and ship goods without relying on U.S.-dominated institutions, American leverage weakens. Venezuela enters the picture precisely at this moment of transition. On paper, Venezuela looks irrelevant. Its economy is shattered. Its oil production has collapsed. Its infrastructure is decayed. Its population has been hollowed out by immigration. But beneath that surface dysfunction lies something that cannot be ignored. The largest proven oil reserves on the planet. Venezuela is not valuable because of what it produces today. It is valuable because of what it could produce under different conditions, and more importantly, how that production would be integrated into the global system. For decades, global oil trade has operated under a simple rule. Oil is priced in US dollars. The system, often referred to as the petrodollar framework, is one of the hidden pillars of American financial power. Because energy is essential, countries around the world must hold dollars to buy it. That creates constant global demand for U.S. currency, allowing the United States to finance deficits, maintain lower borrowing costs, and absorb monetary expansion that would destabilize other economies. But this system depends on compliance, not law. There's no treaty forcing oil to be priced in dollars. It works because it is convenient, liquid, and historically reinforced by political relationships. Once alternatives become viable, the system becomes vulnerable. Over the past decade, those alternatives have quietly emerged. Several major economies have begun settling energy trades in local currencies. China has developed payment systems specifically designed to bypass dollar clearing networks. Regional financial arrangements now exist that reduce reliance on Western banks. None of these developments alone threaten the dollar's role. Together, they signal a slow but meaningful shift. Venezuela was moving toward full participation in this alternative architecture. Reports indicated plans to price oil using a basket of currencies, with the Chinese yuan playing a central role, and to clear transactions through Chinese financial systems. If implemented at scale, this would allow China to secure energy supplies without accumulating dollars, and would demonstrate that large-scale oil trade outside the dollar system is viable. This is where the strategic alarm sounds. The danger is not that Venezuela would immediately flood the market with oil sold to China. The danger is precedent. A country with massive reserves proving that it can operate outside the dollar framework without collapsing undermines the psychological and structural foundations of the existing system. Once that precedent exists, other producers have leverage. They can demand alternative terms. They can diversify currency exposure. They can weaken the automatic demand for dollars that underpins American financial dominance. From this perspective, the events in Venezuela look very different. They are not about rescuing a failed state or correcting a political outcome. They are about preventing the normalization of an alternative energy pricing regime in the Western Hemisphere. Control over Venezuela's future oil production is not about supply today. It is about preserving the rules of the game tomorrow. Public messaging around this reality has been inconsistent, and that inconsistency is revealing. On one hand, officials emphasize governance, legality, and democratic norms. On the other, statements openly reference rebuilding oil infrastructure, granting access to American firms, and redirecting production flows. These are not contradictions, they are layers. One is designed for public consumption. The other reflects strategic intent. The United States does not need Venezuelan oil to fuel its economy today. What it needs is assurance that Venezuelan oil does not become a pillar of a rival economic system tomorrow. That distinction explains why this move happened now, after years of stalemate, and why it unfolded with such speed. This also explains why Venezuela fits into a broader pattern of hemispheric consolidation. Pressure on Canada over trade rules, renewed attention to Greenland's mineral resources, and increased focus on the Panama Canal all serve the same strategic function. They are about securing the economic rear before confronting a peer competitor on a global stage. No major power enters prolonged competition without first stabilizing its immediate environment. This does not mean war is imminent. It means preparation is underway. In strategic planning, the absence of preparation is far more dangerous than preparation that never becomes necessary. Venezuela, in this context, is not an endpoint. It is a signal that economic lines are hardening and that tolerance for ambiguity is shrinking. The critical mistake most analysis makes is focusing on personalities. Leaders matter, but systems matter more. Governments come and go. Oil reserves remain. Trade routes remain. Financial architectures persist long after individual administrations are gone. What happened in Venezuela should be understood as an attempt to realign one of those enduring structures before it slipped beyond reach. By the time these moves become obvious to the public, they are already late stage. Strategic shifts happen quietly through contracts, regulations, asset freezes, and infrastructure control. Military action, when it occurs, is often just the visible tip of a process that has been unfolding for years. That is where we are now. Venezuela is not the story. It is the opening chapter of a much larger contest over resources, currency systems, and economic influence in the Western Hemisphere. And understanding that contest requires abandoning the comforting illusion that this was about one country, one leader, or one crisis. It was about the rules of the system itself. If Part 1 explains why Venezuela matters strategically, Part 2 explains how power is actually enforced once the decision has been made. Modern conflicts are not won primarily with bombs or speeches. They are won through contracts, insurance clauses, payment systems, and legal jurisdiction. This is where the real pressure begins, and it is far less visible than military action, yet far more effective over time. Once the initial intervention phase ends, the focus shifts from force to control. Control does not mean occupation. It means shaping the environment so that only one outcome is economically viable. This is where financial systems, allied institutions, and regulatory choke points become decisive. In Venezuela's case, the most powerful tools are not deployed in Caracas, but in New York, London, Frankfurt, and Brussels. European cooperation is central to this strategy. While the United States provides the coercive signal, European governments and financial institutions provide the enforcement layer. Assets are frozen. Banking relationships are scrutinized. Insurance coverage is withdrawn or priced prohibitively. Shipping firms are warned. Compliance departments quietly shut doors. None of this looks dramatic on television, but together, it creates a cage. In the modern global economy, oil does not move simply because it exists. It moves because it can be insured, financed, transported, and legally settled. Remove any one of those elements, and trade becomes nearly impossible. A tanker without insurance is effectively stranded. A contract without payment clearance is worthless. An asset frozen in a European jurisdiction might as well not exist. This is how economic warfare functions today. It is clean, deniable, and devastatingly effective. It does not require full consensus or public debate. It operates through existing systems that countries already rely on. Venezuela's elites understand this reality better than anyone. Much of their wealth is not held domestically. It is embedded in foreign accounts, real estate, equity stakes, and offshore structures. When those assets are frozen or threatened, political calculations change rapidly. This pressure is not aimed only at the outgoing leadership. It is aimed at anyone who might consider resisting the new alignment. The message is simple and brutally clear. Cooperation preserves access. Resistance produces isolation. This logic applies regardless of ideology. It is transactional, not moral. At the same time, markets begin reacting to a different set of signals. Short-term oil prices barely move because Venezuela's current output is too small to disrupt global supply. OPEC has buffers. U.S. shale production can adjust. On the surface, the system absorbs the shock. But markets are not driven only by present conditions. They are driven by expectations about the future. The expectation now being priced in is that Venezuelan oil production could eventually be restored under a new framework. If infrastructure is rebuilt and output returns to historical levels, Venezuela becomes a significant supplier again. Heavy crude flowing to Gulf Coast refineries, priced in dollars, integrated into Western trading systems. That future scenario reshapes long-term energy forecasts, equity valuations, and investment strategies. Energy companies are already gaming this out, not in public statements, but in internal models. They are weighing the cost of infrastructure rehabilitation against the value of long-term access to massive reserves. They are assessing political risk, security risk, and regulatory clarity. These decisions will take years, not months, and they hinge on one variable above all others: governance. This is where optimism collides with reality. Rebuilding Venezuela's oil sector would require tens of billions of dollars, advanced technology, skilled labor, and years of stable conditions. None of those exist today. Infrastructure is degraded. Human capital has fled. Trust in institutions is shattered. Contracts signed today could be void tomorrow if authority shifts again. This uncertainty freezes capital. No serious firm commits that level of investment without legal clarity and enforceable guarantees. That means the market's optimistic assumptions depend on a smooth political transition. Something history suggests is far from guaranteed. There are three broad trajectories from here, and none of them are clean. The first is a managed transition. In this scenario, a transitional authority emerges with enough legitimacy to enforce contracts, secure infrastructure, and negotiate revenue sharing. International support stabilizes the economy. Oil contracts are renegotiated under dollar-based frameworks. Production slowly recovers. This is the outcome markets want. It is also the hardest to achieve. The second path is fragmentation. Authority splinters. Regional power centers emerge. Security forces fracture. Criminal networks fill gaps. Oil infrastructure becomes a contested asset rather than a productive one. Investment collapses. Production remains constrained. Humanitarian conditions worsen. This is not a hypothetical scenario. It has played out before in other countries where regime change outpaced institution building. The third path is prolonged economic contestation. China does not fully disengage. Instead, it adapts. Oil continues to move through indirect channels. Financial support flows through alternative systems. Diplomatic pressure is applied elsewhere in the region. Venezuela becomes a long-term pressure point rather than a resolved case. This outcome transforms the country into a persistent economic battleground rather than a stabilized supplier. Each of these paths carries different implications for global markets, but all share one feature: uncertainty. And uncertainty is toxic to long-term investment. This is why the most important unanswered question is not about oil prices or political statements. It is about who actually governs Venezuela in practical terms. Governance is not symbolism, it is enforcement. It is who controls security forces, who signs contracts, who collects revenue, and who can guarantee that agreements will be honored 5 or 10 years from now. At the moment, there is no clear answer. Competing claims to authority create paralysis. Businesses wait, banks hesitate, insurers retreat, shipping firms delay. This limbo can persist far longer than headlines suggest, quietly eroding the very outcomes intervention was meant to secure. Zoom out again, and the broader strategy comes into focus. Venezuela is not unique. It is part of a hemispheric consolidation effort. Control over energy resources, control over transit choke points, control over pricing mechanisms. Greenland's minerals, Panama's canal, Canada's trade rules, and Venezuela's oil reserves all sit within this same strategic logic. From one perspective, this approach is rational. No major power willingly allows a rival to build parallel systems inside its sphere of influence. From another perspective, it is risky. Economic containment can provoke countermeasures. Pressure can accelerate diversification. What is meant to preserve dominance can sometimes hasten its erosion. History is filled with examples of interventions that achieved their immediate objective while undermining their long-term goal. Iraq was supposed to stabilize energy markets. Libya was supposed to normalize quickly. Afghanistan was supposed to transition smoothly. In each case, the difficulty was not removing an obstacle, but replacing it with a functioning system. This is the central risk now. Removing a government is an event. Building legitimacy is a process. Markets can price events. They struggle with processes. If Venezuela stabilizes and reintegrates under dollar-based systems, the strategy will be hailed as foresight. If it fragments or becomes a long-term contest zone, the cost will not be measured only in oil output, but in credibility across the region. Other nations will reassess their exposure. They will hedge. They will diversify partners. They will quietly reduce reliance on any single power. That is why this moment matters beyond Venezuela itself. It signals that the economic contest for South America is no longer subtle. It is overt. And the stakes are not ideological. They are structural. What we are witnessing is not the end of a crisis, but the opening of a new phase in global competition where energy, currency, and infrastructure determine outcomes more reliably than rhetoric or military strength alone. Venezuela is simply where those forces have collided most visibly. The final judgment on this strategy cannot be made yet. Too many variables remain unresolved. But one thing is already clear. The story was never about an arrest, a speech, or a press conference. It was about who writes the rules of the economic system in the Western Hemisphere as global power continues to rebalance. And that story is still unfolding.